All right, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. I'm here once again with our apprentice, Cameron Carlson.
Hello.
Yeah,
How's it going?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Excellent. Your beard's looking rather nice today.
Oh, thank you. I forgot to trim my face, though, and my neck, but one of these days I'll do it.
You're looking very mountain man-ish.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm ready to live out in the woods.
Yeah.
You know?
That would be an ideal situation. Just live out in the woods as long as you had internet access and access to trees.
Yep. That's the goal one day.
Yeah.
Out in the woods, in the mountains, just... If I can go on the internet, I'll be fine. But
that's right. Yeah, get on the internet. You can sell your trees. You can, grow a vegetable patch. Yeah. You can hunt rabbits.
Oh man,
yeah, squirrels.
Just walk around the woods all day.
Absolutely.
That'd be something.
That would be the goal. That would be nice. Although right now it sort of feels like that being out here at the nursery. There's nobody around. We live on 10 acres here, but each of our neighbors, we've got, I think, 3 neighbors here. Each of them has about 10 acres or so. Okay. So altogether it's 40 or 50 acres total, and there's nobody back here. So it feels nice and
open.
Yeah, nice and open and quiet. And since we've got the COVID-19 situation going on, no one's coming to the nursery.
True.
Yeah, we've sort of closed down for the summer. But I would like to open up, but my wife is a little bit apprehensive about doing so. So we're going to keep closed through the rest of the summer, and then classes will start up again in late August, early September. So hopefully by then things will have settled down a little bit.
I hope so, because it's weird. It's weird not seeing students and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's very strange.
I lose track of the days.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We don't have weekends with classes in them, so it's like, oh, God, what is today?
It's very true. Yeah, it's hard to keep track of stuff. And, we're working basically 7 days a week, so it's kind of hard to tell what's a Monday and what's a Saturday.
Yeah, exactly.
Feels a little bit strange. So normally we have the classes Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Mm-hmm. So I kind of, that to me is like the work week.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you have Mondays off typically, and then, we're working the rest of the week on trees. But right now it's just every day working trees, water and stuff. It's gotten ridiculously hot here.
It's killing me, I swear. Oh man, everyone keeps warning me, and then it's been like over 90 for the last week. It feels like.
Oh yeah, and it's just early summer. It's going to get worse and worse.
Oh my God.
And the nice thing is it's not even that humid right now. In the mornings it's a little bit humid. By the time you get to the afternoon, it tones down a little bit. So if you go in the shade, it's not ridiculously hot.
Yeah.
And we don't have air conditioner out here in the workshop. We've just got fans. So,
yeah,
it's surprising how well they cool you off, though.
Yeah, just a little air movement. Like as soon as I get out of the fan, I can see my arms start to get shiny and stuff like that. I'm just like wiring a tree or something. It's like I come back from watering and I'm just like
drenched.
Yeah. And I haven't even spilled any on myself.
Yeah, at Fujikawa-san's place, he actually, in the workshop, it was a lot smaller workshop than this. It was probably, the space that we worked in was called the shigotoba, which translates to workspace. It was maybe 1/5, 1/6 of the size of this workshop. It's only a few feet wide and twice as deep, basically. So 2 of us would work in there. There was an air conditioner unit in the back on the wall, but he wouldn't let us turn it on.
What?
Because he was afraid that the wind from the air conditioner blasting down on the trees all day would dry them out. He'd end up losing foliage, losing branches on the plant. So he would only let us use fans in the workshop. Yeah, it was miserable. And it's the same, type of temperatures there, 38, 39 degrees Celsius, which is, upper 90s Fahrenheit, 100% humidity. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't want to imagine it worse, but
yeah,
it keeps getting worse.
Absolutely. You were just talking too before we started the podcast about going back to Montana at some point.
Oh yeah,
setting things up out there. What kind of soil would you use in an environment like that? Because the soil that we use here is basically 50% Akadama, 25% Kiryu, which is like a larger river sand, and then 25% lava rock. So it's very fast draining.
Yeah.
Really the only thing that holds a lot of moisture is the Akadama, and even that dries out pretty quickly. So what would you use, out in Montana to sort of offset that issue? And I think probably 100% Akadama, or maybe like a 50-50 pumice Akadama mix. Pumice holds a lot of moisture, and Akadama does as well. Akadama will also retain a lot of the fertilizer, for the nutrient base for the plant. So, technically Akadama has a slight cationic exchange. within it, which means it's actually absorbing, the fertilizer, holding those elements, and then, sort of slow releasing those to the tree to some degree. But still, if you plant a tree in that, 50% akadama, 25% kidu, 25% lava mix, put it outside, you water it, especially in the spring right after you repot it, you'll watch the water just pour right out the bottom holes. It doesn't look like it's absorbing much, but that one element that really is holding a lot of moisture is akadama. Okay. And then, of course, if you don't, I think we may have mentioned it last time, but if you don't have access to akadama, you can just use pure pumice, and that gives you a similar effect. It doesn't hold as much fertilizer, but it stays relatively moist, but it's still pretty free draining and provides a lot of aeration to the soil.
Pretty porous.
Exactly. Yeah. So out in Montana, you'd have probably easy access to pumice. Oh, sure. A lot of the pumice, comes from New Mexico, which is not too far away. I mean, it's a lot closer than Tennessee is to Montana. So, that could be a decent option for a very arid environment like that.
It's wild.
Yeah.
Wild how different it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the problem, when you're teaching bonsai and traveling and trying to tell people what to do in certain seasons. You have to find ways to adjust to their particular environment or their particular climate, as everybody's is slightly different. Even, in the States, just a couple hours north of here, a couple hours south of here, it's going to be slightly different. Oh, yeah. We're going to talk about in our Technique of the Week section today about decandling double flush pines. And the timing for that kind of stuff is totally dependent on your particular environment. Like here in Tennessee, I keep saying East Tennessee because I'm from East Tennessee, but we're actually technically Middle Tennessee here in Nashville. Our seasons shift about 2 weeks earlier than they do in Osaka, right? So, the decandling process, we have to adjust it, a week to 2 weeks earlier than we would in Osaka. So it's slightly different. Like we would always start the decandling process in mid-June, essentially right on June 15th. Okay. That was the starting date, and we'd run through early July, mid-July with those techniques. Well, here we start basically the end of May, beginning of June, through the end of June, early July. So it's just slightly offset by about 2 weeks, and that makes a big difference for needle length. And we're going to get into that a little bit later in the podcast. But that's one thing. Like when we get asked questions in the mailbag on the podcast, or when I travel and teach, it's so difficult to teach those things because there's so many different variables that you have to deal with. So what I try to do is give more sort of visual cues to people. Like when you see the tree looking like this in your environment, it'll be somewhere in this span of time typically. Then you'll know you can perform this type of technique. Okay. Right. So, giving those visual cues tends to work quite a bit better. And then it gets even more difficult when you go to the southern hemisphere, like down to Australia. Shout out to all my people in the land down under. I don't even know if they actually call themselves the land down, or call it, the land down under down there. Maybe that's just an American thing.
What do they call it? Oz?
Oz, yeah. Yeah, so
Australia.
So when you go down there, you have to flip everything completely the opposite direction. So I have to rely on folks who are there, who are professionals or who have done it a long time, to help me, give me kind of a general range that they're working with, and then we can talk about the visual cues that you're going to see, sometime in that particular range of time or span of time. So it makes it very difficult, to travel and teach. So. If anybody, ever tells you in a video or, in a podcast or anything that you have to do it this way, they're wrong. Yeah. You don't have don't listen to people like that. Be very weary of what they're saying to you, or at the very least question what they're saying or question their motives, because there are way too many variables involved. And it's just dishonest to say that it has to be done a certain way, and this is the only way you're going to get this type of result out of the tree. Now, that being said, we're dealing with horticultural science, right? So, there are going to be, dependent on the variables, certain techniques that you can apply to trees to get certain objective results. So there is, some overlap there. You should be taking certain things seriously, but you should also question anybody who ever says it has to be done this particular way, because it's not necessarily true. I've been getting back into like lifting a little bit lately.
Throwing out your back.
Throwing out my back. I threw my back out last week. I threw my back out, and then later that night, Nancy was like, "You do realize you're not 18 anymore." I'm not that old yet. She goes, "No, you're already a middle-aged man." You're older than I am. So what does that make you? Ooh. I didn't say that to her, and none of you guys out there who are listening to this or watching this, repeat that to Nancy.
Be careful, mister.
Be very, very careful. But I've been watching a lot of these videos online. And, a lot of that information is a lot of the top guys online who are talking about fitness. they're doing it in a really good way where they're giving you, scientific papers that say, for this particular result, these are the things you should be looking to do. But the problem is almost none of them say it's going to vary person to person, environment to environment. You have to be able to adjust, and, person to person, meaning your personal metabolism, what you have access to food wise in your local area. You may have things that are high in protein, but they're different from what they're telling you. But that's just because this type of grain or this type of bean or this type of lentil or whatever grows in your area, and the stuff they're talking about doesn't. So it's the same thing with bonsai. There's too many variables to say 100% of the time it has to be done this way. So, I always try to hedge against that, or provide that caveat anyway in the videos that we do, the BONSAI-U videos and the stuff that we talk about in the podcast. So just keep that in mind, as you're interacting with videos online or listening to professionals or, so-called professionals traveling and teaching and providing you with information. Take it with a grain of salt. Always be skeptical. There's nothing wrong with being skeptical, but don't be an ass about it either.
Exactly.
Just because they say, this is the results that I've had and this is how I think you should do it, doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong either.
Yeah.
Take the information, take it with a grain of salt, try it out, test it out in your environment, see how it works, and then adjust from there. That's the best you can do.
Exactly.
Oh yeah. It's like here in the States, a lot of the species that we're working with, native material wise, a lot of that stuff hasn't really been utilized in bonsai, or there hasn't been true experimentation to figure out how to get specific results.
Yeah.
Like the American hornbeam is a perfect example. It's a fantastic species for bonsai. Just like any deciduous species, you're going to find a range of leaf size. You'll find teeny tiny natural leaves on some, because of genetic variants, and you'll find massive leaves and then everything in between. So what I've noticed, in the past, and this was when I was a kid, 15, 16 years old, there were a lot of people going out and collecting American hornbeams. They're going out collecting, giant ones that were 20 feet tall, cutting them down, trunk chopping them. So they have a nice flare naturally. But you chop them down so you get that nice big flare and then the nice big trunk, but they never heal properly. There's a reason why they're called ironwood.
Yeah.
The big wounds just don't heal. It's a very, very hard wood. It's very similar, in my opinion, to Pseudocydonia wood, and actually texture-wise, it's actually quite similar as well. You hack those trees down, you get a big wound on them, 2 inches, 3 inches in diameter. That's going to be very difficult to heal. And you may actually end up causing death down the side of the trunk, below that wound. So that's one element of it. And then the other element is, a lot of those trees that were collected before were only collected for the wide base, and no attention was paid to the natural leaf size on the tree. It was just assumed that you put it in a pot, maybe you could try to defoliate it, or just keeping it in a pot's going to reduce the leaf size. I don't know if that's necessarily true. You put it in a smaller pot, maybe the leaf size will reduce over time. Yeah. But if you're dealing with something with a large leaf size to begin with, you're never going to get fine branching if that's a goal that you have, right? So, okay, maybe we can defoliate the tree to produce a smaller leaf size. Well, again, if the leaf size is large, no matter how much you defoliate, it's always going to be a crappy branch structure on the tree. Right. So, you have to figure out, is this a species that can be defoliated? Can I select for a smaller leaf size? Does that exist? Okay. If it does, I should be searching that out, taking that and then experimenting with it and seeing if I can defoliate it. Okay. Well, that's another thing. I don't know if American hornbeams are easily, if you can defoliate them like you could a Pseudocydonia or a flowering apricot, like what we did in the BONSAI-U video back in May with that flowering apricot, partial outer canopy defoliation. Right, I don't know if you can necessarily do that on a consistent basis. If you look at, one thing you can do is look at other species from other countries that are similar, that are all the same genus, like, Korean hornbeam, Japanese hornbeam. All right, well, are those trees typically partially defoliated? Well, no, they're not. Only in very, very specific cases are they partially defoliated, but you can't do it year after year after year on those species, because just like a Japanese maple, you're going to get some big leaves, some small leaves, and some dieback on a tree. You basically destroy the energy balance on the plant. So, can you do that with an American hornbeam? My guess is probably not, based on the other carpinus that you work with from around the world. That being said, there's nothing wrong with experimenting with it and trying it out. I wouldn't do it with a tree that's already spectacular or well on its way to being very, very nice.
Just go for it.
Just go for it. No, I would buy some younger, cheaper, weaker material. Weaker, but cheaper, smaller material. Try it out with that. See how it works. See if you get consistent results with it year after year, and then start applying it across the board to those species. If it doesn't work, set it aside. Apply a different technique that would be utilized with trees that can't be partially defoliated like that. right? So you just got to experiment with the natural stuff in your environment, you know? I think you would probably agree, right? The stuff we have in the States is easily has as much potential as anything anywhere else in the world, including Japan.
I think more.
I would say so.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Just the things I can't wait to find. Well, I want to get more acquainted around here, but even especially out west.
Oh, yeah.
In the mountains. Oh, think of the gems, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, where I'll be. Oh,
man. Yeah. I mean, Montana, Wyoming, all the stuff at the high elevations out there, especially the conifers. Everybody knows about the Rocky Mountain junipers, and people are starting to understand about the 1C junipers, which is my personal favorite conifer from the States, from the New Mexico area, Utah, parts of Wyoming, Arizona, places like that. We have unbelievably great potential in our coniferous material here, easily as good as anywhere in the world. And I would say with the junipers in particular, I don't think there's anywhere else in the world that can match what we have in the States. I honestly think that that's the case. I've actually gotten pushback from other professionals on that. It's just an opinion, I guess, but I would much rather have my, 1,000-year-old 1C juniper down there than a rinky-dink little Sabina juniper from Spain. No offense. I mean, some of those Sabinas are quite cool. Yeah. There's some interesting ones, but when you set them side by side and compare the deadwood, they're incomparable. I mean, the 1C junipers are just insane in terms of the deadwood relative to a Sabina juniper. It's the same thing too. Like a lot of the guys in Japan saw the Sabina junipers online, professionals, and they wanted to import them. So they imported quite a few to Japan. Once they got there, though, they realized that the deadwood is really not that interesting. It's not very striated. It doesn't have a lot of character to it. You set it next to an Itoigawa, a naturally collected Itoigawa. The foliage is sometimes somewhat similar, but the deadwood is it doesn't compare at all. Itoigawa is way more interesting. So, and we're going to get crapped on, I'm sure, by a lot of the folks in Spain and overseas, but it's my personal opinion. I like Sabinas. They're cool trees, but they're not nearly as cool, in my opinion, as some of our native junipers here. So cool. All right. So we're going to jump into the next segment here, and that's going to be our, technique of the week.
Sure.
That's it. Yeah. All right. All right, welcome to Technique of the Week, where we take a specific bonsai-related technique and talk about it. So I actually got an email from someone last week. They were like, I really don't like the format of this thing you're doing on YouTube where you're just sitting there talking. It's so boring. But this is a podcast, and we're doing a video version, a vidcast version of it. So if you don't like it, stop watching it. This is us sitting down talking. We're hoping you guys are out there drinking a beer, maybe drinking some coffee or something, hanging out. We're just, shooting the breeze, having some fun, and hanging out. That's what it's about. So, tough cookies.
Talk shit, get hit.
That's right. That was our talk shit, get hit segment for this particular episode. Before we get into Technique of the Week, though, I want to read one of our ads from one of our sponsors here. Bonsai enthusiasts know that using the proper tools, soil, and fertilizer are essential for maintaining healthy bonsai. Superfly Bonsai is your bonsai superstore with everything you need from brands like Kiku, Potted Tree Gadgetry, Mucko, and Samurai Tools. They carry premium quality premixed soil and substrates from the US and Japan, including Akadama, Kiryu, Kanuma, Hyuga, Lava, Pumice, and more. I got it. Yeah. I'm enunciating. Ow, now, brown cow.
Red leather, yellow leather.
Red leather, yellow leather. Superfly Bonsai also has a wide assortment of pots made from mica, plastic, and ceramics from around the globe. Become a Superfly VIP member and earn points with every purchase to redeem for discounts and free products. Browse their enormous Harrisburg, Pennsylvania showroom and nursery in person, or shop online at superflybonsai.com and take advantage of the free shipping on all retail orders over $99. Enter Bjorn10OFF at checkout to receive 10% off your entire order. That's BJORN10OFF at checkout, and you'll get 10% off your entire order.
Nice.
Pretty cool. All right. Okay. So that brings us to our technique of the week. And this week at Eisei-en, what have we been working on mostly, Cameron?
We've been doing a lot of decandling.
Yes, we have. Yeah, we've been working with our double flush pines this week, working on decandling those species. So basically, a majority of the pines that you're going to be working with are going to fall into what's called a single flush pine category, meaning that they put out one flush of candle growth in the spring. You cannot really induce them to put out a second flush of growth. And that's what makes them a single flush pine. And the other category of pines are going to be your double flush pines. These are pines that will produce two candle flushes in a single growing season if induced to do so. So it's not that, they put one flush of candle out in the spring and then on top of that there's another flush coming out of the same candle. What it means is that first flush that comes out in spring, at a very specific point in summer, we actually remove all of those candles, and at the base of where you cut those candles off, a new set of growth emerges from that spot. That's your second flush of growth, making them a double flush pine. So there really are only 3 species of pine that I would truly consider to be double flush pines, and those would be Japanese black pine. Everybody's familiar with that one. Japanese red pine, Pinus densiflora, and then the third one is our native pitch pine here in the U.S. We did a little bit of experimentation last year with our Virginia pines to see if those were truly double flush pines. We had mixed results with them, so I don't really want to include them in here. We had some branches that flushed out consistently with the second flush of growth and other branches that didn't. And we did it in a very similar manner to what we're going to talk about here with these techniques, and it just didn't produce good results. So we're going to set those aside. So basically, probably the best starting point is going to be the spring. What we do with fertilization with these 3 species to build them up to the point of decandling. So take it away, Cameron. When do we start fertilizing our double flush pines?
God, we started fertilizing pretty early, didn't we? Like March-ish?
March, yeah, exactly. So just as soon as, new growth starts to not emerge, but, those buds from last year start to swell a little bit, start to see some movement in the tree, which for us here in Nashville is going to be essentially early March. So basically March 1st, we start fertilization of those species, and we go pretty heavy duty with that. We want to, pump up these trees to be nice and strong, nice and healthy up to the point of decandling in the summer. So we're using, I think I mentioned it before in the podcast, but we're using something called Grow Power.
Oh, those little pucks.
Yeah, little pucks. Yeah. Basically, it's an organic fertilizer that's produced in the States out in California. It's a 12-8-8, so quite high on the nitrogen. But it's got a whole bunch of micronutrients in it. It's got humic acid as well, which is very beneficial in plant growth. So we start fertilizing heavily with that. As a matter of fact, I would say, the amount that we use of that Grow Power, and this could go for BioGold or any other, I would stick with organic fertilizer. You're going to use basically twice as much as you would with any other species. Okay. So how should I say this? If you've got sort of an average medium-sized tree in a pot that's, let's say, 30 centimeters, 12 inches across by, 10 inches front to back, something along those lines, we'd be filling that up with a fertilizer cake. These fertilizer cakes are about 50-cent piece size. So, what's that, a couple centimeters across in diameter, I guess. Yeah. We would be putting one of those fertilizer cakes basically spaced, I'd say probably about 3 to 4 fingers apart. If you want to do that, probably about 3 fingers apart, around the whole pot, the periphery of the whole pot. So we're loading these guys up in the spring, pumping the growth as much as possible, right? So, we're doing that up until the point that we decandle the plant. So typically what we do is once a month, we switch out those fertilizer cakes. Now the Grow Power, they claim that you can put them on and leave them on for months and months at a time. They're not designed for bonsai, and they're not doing the same things necessarily with the plants that they're recommending it for as we are with bonsai. So typically with the Grow Power, instead of months and months, we'll do maybe 2 months before we switch them out. But your typical average organic fertilizer cake is going to be spent after about 4 weeks, after about 1 month. BioGold will be like that, Maruta, Tamahi, those type of things. You place those on the soil surface, you switch them out every 4 weeks. So if you're starting, the beginning of March with that, you put the next group on in early April, then the next group on in early May. And then here in Tennessee, like I said, we start decandling our largest black pines, red pines, and pitch pines in, we'll say early June, basically June 1st. We'll just start with that, makes it easy here. So the last application of fertilizer that we actually put on is 1 month before we're going to decandle those trees. The idea being you put that fertilizer on, it sort of tapers off and is spent by the time you get to the point that you need to decandle, right? So why would we decandle these species, Cameron? What are the things that we're going for here?
We want to balance energy to different sections of the plant, and probably pushing that growth gives us nicer ramification down out on the tips and whatnot.
Exactly, yeah. So there's those are included in what we're going to talk about here, but there's essentially 2 or 3 main reasons why we're decandling. So one, like Cameron said, would be energy balance across the tree. We're trying to create a consistent needle length across the plant. The idea being, that you want to create proportionality in the tree. The larger the tree, the slightly longer the needles you want. The smaller the tree, the smaller the needles you want. So you want proportionality there, but you want consistent, even needle length, ideally across the entire plant. So using certain techniques for decandling will get you that. The second thing is we want to expedite ramification, so the production of secondary and tertiary branches on the tree. So each time we decandle a tree like this, you get second flush of growth. That second flush of growth, say you've got one candle that you're cutting off, you remove that. At the base of that, you're going to get anywhere from 2 to 5 new buds, right? So you're getting a tremendous number of buds to then select from later. Now, it doesn't matter if you get 2, 3, 4, or 5 in the fall. We're going to select back to just 2. At each location. If you have more than 2 buds emerging from any location over extended period of time, it's going to start swelling at the base where all of those buds are coming out. So we always cut back to 2, but it's nice to have additional buds to select from. Right, so decandling is going to give you that second flush of growth. And then, like I said, depending on the time of the growing season that you actually decandle these trees, the earlier you do it, the longer the needles are, the later you do it, the smaller they are. So you can create that proportionality within the plant. So essentially you get really basically 3 benefits out of it: energy balance, needle length reduction, or balancing proportionality-wise within the tree, and more ramification. So those 3 benefits come out of this. So let's start with the biggest trees. Basically, June 1st, we're letting these trees just grow. If you get candle growth on your trees that's 30 centimeters long, not a problem. Leave it alone. Don't break it in half. It's not necessary. You're going to be cutting that stuff off anyway. So you let it flush out. Now, we're doing, like I said, our big trees in early June here, decandling those species. You may need to do it slightly earlier in your location. You may need to do it slightly later in your location. What really matters is the amount of time that you have left in your growing season after you decandle. That's going to dictate when you need to perform decandling on these trees. So one good starting point, this is not absolute, but it's just a good starting point, is figure out the average sort of first day of frost in the fall, and then count backwards into the summer about 100 days. That'll give you a good starting point for most of your trees. You will then have to adjust slightly further forward, slightly further backward, depending on your situation. But find that average first frost date of the year, and you can find that information online. AccuWeather and weather.com and those type of places should have that information available for your area, and then count back 100 days from there, and that'll be a good starting point. So again, in Japan, this would have been basically June 15th when we started. Here in Nashville, we're starting on June 1st. So there are a few ways to decandle these species depending on where they are in their stage of development versus refinement. So as a matter of fact, next week in our Bonsai-U video, we're going to be putting out a video about Japanese black pines in particular, working on a tree that's a piece of rough material, field-grown material, and showing you what you can cut off, why we're decandling certain portions of the tree, why we're not decandling other sections of the tree, so you can get a full understanding visually of what we're talking about here. But let's just take a tree that is in early development, right? One of the goals with trees like that is that you want to, I see a squirrel running across the fence there. Man. If I had my gun here, I'd take them out.
They usually leave as soon as we're here.
Oh my God.
I'll go to the back to check on things when I get here in the morning, and 5 squirrels will fly up and I'll jump over the fence, and they're like, oh, it's time to leave.
They're my enemies. They're my mortal enemies.
They know they're not wanted here.
All right. Okay. Sorry. Back to the subject at hand here. In any case, let's just take a tree that is a raw piece of material. Now, a majority of those those trees, what you're going to want to do is, thicken certain areas of the tree. That may be thickening the trunk. It might be thickening the first branch, for example. What you want to do is select a terminal bud, a terminal candle on each of those areas. Say you want to thicken the trunk. Find a terminal bud at the very, very top of the tree. Let that candle grow all year long, maybe 2, 3, 4 years, until you get the thickening that you want on the bottom of the plant. Same thing, like if you want your first directional branch to thicken, let the terminal candle at the very end of that branch elongate and grow for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, depending on the situation, until you get the diameter of that branch where you want it to be. At the same time that you're doing that, all of the secondary branches or all of the secondary growth that's a little bit further back in on that, say, directional branch, you can be decandling that section of the branch and developing ramification at the same time that you're developing the thickening of the branch. The techniques are not mutually exclusive. You can do them at the same time, right? So you can kill two birds with one stone. And again, in the video next week, you guys are going to be able to see this in real time, so you understand exactly what we're talking about here. But you can decandle that internal section of the branch. Now, with decandling, what you want to make sure you're doing is assessing each individual bud on the tree. I hear it all the time. People will say, okay, the top portion of the tree, because these trees are apically dominant, the top portion of the tree, the apex, the upper branches are going to be way stronger than the lower branching on the tree. That's not necessarily true. If you look at each individual bud, each individual branch on the tree, you're going to find on the top of the tree a range of very weak candles all the way up to very strong candles, and on the bottom portion of the tree, you're going to find exactly the same thing. So you can't just willy-nilly decandle certain portions of the tree or take the top section, middle section, and lower section. It doesn't work like that. You have to assess each individual branch and each individual bud. So what I would recommend is you look for essentially sort of three types of buds. You're weak, very, very weak, you're sort of medium strength, and then you're very, very strong candles. So, what would you say visually those look like, Cameron?
I mean, the strong ones look fine. They're nice and extended. Maybe they don't have needles all the way up because they pushed out so hard, I guess. And then medium is pushed and needly, but not going crazy. And then I'd say the weak ones can be harder to see the actual extension on it.
Exactly, yeah. So there's a section, you've got old needles from last year, you've got the new candle coming out, and then out of that new candle you'll have new needles emerging. So on the stronger candles, there'll actually be a section between last year's needles and this year's needles, just an expanse, like the shaft of the candle where there's no needles, right? That's what's called a jiku in Japanese, Jiku. So the longer and thicker that section is, and the longer the candle is, obviously the stronger that candle is. The smaller that section, the shorter the candle, the weaker the candle is. So you want to find those three types of candles on the tree, and then depending on the stage of development of the tree, you'll decandle these at different rates or at different times. So it gets a little bit confusing here. So again, let's just stick with our tree that is in development, early stages, medium stages of development. What I would recommend, most of those trees are going to have a wide variation in terms of candle strength. You have really, really weak ones and really strong ones. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how to balance those. So one of the best techniques you can do is a two-step technique where you decandle. All right, before we start with this, just leave the weak ones completely alone. Don't touch those at all at this stage. We want to pump those up and build those up. The first step in this process is to actually decandle the medium strength candles. Okay. The idea here is that we take those candles, we cut them all the way back to the base. You're cutting them back to last year's growth, just flush to last year's growth. Cut the medium strength ones first, and what that does is it activates whatever latent buds are around the base of that candle to start flushing. So you cut those off. Then 2 weeks later, 14 days later or so, you go through and you decandle the largest candles. So the idea here is that you've now delayed the second flush on the largest, strongest areas of the trees while you've already allowed the medium strength areas to start flushing. So by the time you get to the fall, all of those should be ostensibly an even strength. So you're making noises on that.
Just purring into the mic.
Yeah, Sam has jumped up on Cameron's lap here. So
don't eat the cord.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
He's just chilling.
All right. So that would be one way of starting to balance energy in the tree. So again, don't decandle the weak ones at all. Medium strength ones there, you're going to decandle first, and then 2 weeks later, you're going to decandle the strong ones. All right, so that's one way to do it. At the same time that you're doing this, what you need to understand is that in each area of the tree, the more needles you have, the more old needles you have, the more those needles are producing food for that particular branch. So if you have a high density of needles in any given area, that's going to produce more food for that particular branch and make it stronger. So one of the reasons why you're probably going to have large candles, strong candles in certain areas is because there's already a large number of old needles in that area that have produced a lot of food for that section of the plant. So when you decandle the tree in summer, you should be doing some needle plucking at the same time. Now, as a general rule of thumb, to balance everything out, the weak areas, of course, you don't touch anything. You don't touch any of the old needles. You don't touch any of that new growth that's coming out. The medium strength areas, when you decandle those, you want to remove some of the old needles and leave somewhere, around 10 to 12 pairs of needles in a radial pattern around the base of that candle that you just removed. When you remove the stronger candles a couple weeks later, you want to thin those areas out to somewhere between, let's say, 5 to 7 pairs of needles. So you've significantly weakened the strong areas, you've left the medium-sized areas, medium-strength areas with a little bit more needle growth on them, and you've left the weak areas with all of their old needle growth. So this is a second step in the process of balancing energy on a tree that's in early stages of development. Does that make sense? I think so.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. If you want to see a visual of that in particular, I'll put a link in the description down below to my intermediate course, online course with Bonsai Empire. We actually talk about that specifically in there, so you can get a good visual sense of what that looks like and how that process actually works. Yeah. All right. So for trees that are further along in development or moving more into refinement, by that stage, one sign that they're sort of moving into that sort of segment of development or into refinement is that the needles are already relatively well balanced. So you don't really find as wide of a range of sizes of candles. You're still going to have, weak, medium, and strong, regardless of where it is in development or refinement, but you're going to have less of a range there. The smaller ones aren't going to be so small relative to the bigger ones. Everything's sort of balanced out, and the needle size should be essentially consistent across the tree. On those, we treat them a little bit differently. You can actually do a full decandling on something like that, like almost 100%. Now, the absolute weakest, teeniest, tiniest the new candles that are coming out, the weakest ones, I still wouldn't touch those necessarily. But the medium and strong ones, or even the slightly weak ones, you can go ahead and just decandle them all at the same time. Not a problem at all. And in those cases, we're taking the old growth on the tree, the old needles, knocking it down to 5 to 7 pairs across basically the entire tree, right? So you don't have to worry about the 10 to 12 or 5 to 7. It's not as confusing. You just knock everything down to 5 to 7 pairs around each of those candles that you just removed, balances everything out, get that second flush of growth. And then by the time you get to fall, basically September or so, that second flush has come out, hardened off. Again, you've got 2 to 5 buds at any one location. You can select back to 2. Now, when fall rolls around this year, we'll talk about that next step in the process with these in terms of how to select for which buds are best at that time of year. But for right now, all we want to cover is the decandling process in the summer. Right. So again, in a couple of weeks, I'll show you another video as well on a more refined black pine. This will be a second part in our decandling series, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about there. And actually on that particular tree that we're going to be showing in a couple of weeks, I decandled the entire thing, but I didn't pluck the needles on the tree. And the reason I didn't pluck the needles on the tree is because each area on the plant already had a consistent number of needles across the whole thing, so it wasn't necessary. So sometimes you only have to decandle. Again, just like we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, every situation is slightly different, and there are all sorts of variables that you're going to have to deal with and think about in situations that are going to arise that we can't necessarily specify here, because we'd have a 20-hour podcast. It'd be ridiculous. But just understand that you got to assess where it is in its development, where it is in refinement, and then adjust your technique from there. But the two main takeaways are going to be, figuring out how to balance the energy based on decandling, specifically, with the size of the candles, and then balancing energy with needle plucking. And as those things balance each other out, the techniques become easier and easier. There's less you have to do to balance that energy because it's already relatively well balanced. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention here with these double flush pines. We talked about fertilization in the spring up until the point that we decandle. Once we decandle, one of the purposes of decandling, of course, is to reduce the needle size on the tree. So if you decandle and continue to fertilize after you decandle, that next flush of growth is just going to elongate, get bigger, and it's going to look like crap. You're going to have long needles, basically. So what you want to do when you decandle is cut all fertilization. So no fertilizer at all summer long, up until the point that second flush of growth completely hardens off in late August, September, somewhere in that range. Then you can start fertilizing again. And again, at that time of year, this year, we're going to talk about, that process with fertilizing, the process with bud selection, and the process of bud formation for the following year. All of that happens August through September, basically. So we'll be talking about that in an upcoming episode of the podcast. And then the final thing we'll mention here is that, again, the earlier you do it in the season, the longer the second flush of growth is going to be, because you've got a longer growing season still left. So we do the bigger trees first, medium-sized trees we'll do a couple weeks later, and then the Shohin trees we'll do a couple weeks after that. So, early June here, we're doing the big trees. Late June, early July, we're decandling the Shohin trees. Because, again, the later you wait, the less growing season you have after you decandle, which means there's less time for that second flush of growth to elongate, right? So you want to do your Shohin trees a little bit later. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
It's kind of a tabs on how many solar panels you got, and then you can build more if you got more solar panels. So it kind of keeps it out and keeps the tiny things tinier.
Exactly. That's the plan.
At different times, yeah.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you can see the tree in the tokonoma behind us here. This is a Japanese black pine that we just decandled a couple of days ago. This is one of our, not biggest trees, but a little bit larger plants, a little bit bigger than a medium-sized tree. So we did it, slightly early in June, and we actually wired it up. Wiring these trees up after you decandle is actually a really good time to do it. Now, I wouldn't do, heavy, massive, crazy bends on a black pine at that time, but simple detail wiring on a black pine right after you decandle it, right after you do some needle plucking, not a big deal at all. So this tree will then put out second flush of growth. By the time we get to fall, we're going to have twice as much ramification on this tree, and it's going to look twice as full, which will be great, So you can expedite that development process with these double flush pines. So I hope that gives you some good information to go on, and it wasn't too confusing. But like I said, next week and in a couple weeks after that, we'll have 2 videos on how to decandle these species, so you can get a nice visual understanding of what we're discussing here. Okay, so before we get into the next segment here, we're going to read our second ad for the podcast. This ad comes from Taki Bonsai in Norway. Taki Bonsai is Norway's premier and leading bonsai shop located close to Norway's capital, Oslo. They sell both outdoor and tropical bonsai and everything you need for cultivating bonsai trees. As well as selling bonsai products, they arrange workshops, demos, and every year they get great bonsai professionals from around the world to do workshops and demos at their location. So some of the professionals they've had in the past are Peter Warren from England, Jan Kulik from Czech Republic, and some jackass named Bjorn Bjorholm. Boo. Boo. At the garden center, you will also be able to visit their 6,000 square meter open show garden. The show garden includes the owner, Marius Foss's bonsai collection with around 60 bonsai trees and 1,000 different plants, including 500 rhododendrons. It's a beautiful, spectacular location. Let's see. The garden has many Japanese-inspired elements which are under constant development. If you want to know more about Taki Bonsai, visit their website at takibonsai.no. That's takibonsai.no. So definitely go check them out. Yeah. All right. So we didn't do this in the last episode, but this time around we're going to jump into Cameron's Tolkien tree talk.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody ready for it? Let's do it.
Oh, hello again. Today, our quote from Tolkien is, "Every tree has its enemy. Few have an advocate."
Okay, that brings us to the last segment of the podcast, and that is answering questions from the mailbag. These questions are only from our patrons, so people who donate to BONSAI-U or donate to the podcast. Sam is rubbing all over my legs here.
He likes the Crocs.
He does, yeah. So, if you want to have your question answered on a future podcast, good God, Sam, quit it. You can, donate to BONSAI-U or donate to the podcast at our website. It's, I think, bjornbjorholm.com/donate. So you can donate $1, $5, $1 million, whatever you want to do, and then you can send us some of your questions, and we'll answer them in a podcast episode. So this first question for this episode comes from a fella named Will Cruz. He says, "I have a multi-trunk variegated ficus that has been losing all of its leaves. I've had it for about 3 years. I haven't repotted it or done anything to it since I purchased it from my local bonsai club show in San Diego. Other than fertilize it with BioGold, but not this season. Does it need to be repotted? Could it be a root rot problem from too much water, too cold of a winter with lots of cold wind and rain this past winter, or not enough sun? I have it under shade and it gets evening sun." Okay, so it could be any number of those things there. So let's start with the repotting. So you said you've had it for about 3 years and haven't repotted it. I would say it's probably time to repot it. The soil that you say you have it in, it says it's akadama mixed with potting soil. Get it out of that as quickly as possible. It could be, I mean, that stuff, once it dries out, it's hard to re-soak it again. So it could be that it's underwatered. It could be that you've soaked it too much and it's got root rot. It's hard for me to say without actually seeing the tree, but I would get it out of that mix, and I would actually probably put it in your location there in 100% Akadama. I think would be fine. Like I said, it holds a lot of moisture, but it is relatively free draining, at least relative to the potting mix that you're using. So I would switch it out. And the thing with ficus too is the best time to repot those is going to be in the heat of summer. So, June, I would say anytime this month would be a good time to repot the tree. My guess is it's probably going to lose all of its leaves. You might actually want to go ahead and just defoliate the tree, repot it, put it back out in not necessarily full sun, but if you got a place where you can have morning sun and then afternoon shade, particularly in San Diego, good God, it's hotter than Hades down there. I would do that, particularly right after you do the repotting. And then, as it adjusts, you can move it pretty much back out into full sun. Ficus will do quite well out in full sun, as long as you're keeping it watered properly. And with that kind of soil, if you switch it to pure Akadama, watering twice a day is going to be, I think, a necessity with that particular tree. So you definitely want to keep an eye on that. So hopefully that'll, get you back on the right track. But I would try to I wouldn't necessarily do, a full bare root on a tree like that, but I try to pick away at a majority of that old soil with a chopstick, keep as many of the old roots as you can, unless, of course, they're dead. Cut those out, of course. You may even want to, just for safety's sake, if you think it might be a root rot issue, when you're repotting, after you finish repotting, have a bucket of water with about 1 tablespoon per gallon of decanyl already mixed in that bucket, and then just soak the entire tree, dunk the entire thing, root ball and everything, pot and everything into that bucket of decanyl. It sounds a little bit extreme, but if you do have a root rot problem, it will help tremendously. Decanyl will kill off about 75 diseases on trees. We actually had some trees here this spring that were, on death's door because of fungal issues in the roots. Dunked them, they all came back. So I definitely recommend that you do that just as a safety mechanism, just in case. Nothing wrong with that. Did I miss anything?
Sound pretty good.
Okay.
I don't know. The way I see it, you can look at a ficus wrong and it'll drop its leaves.
This is true. Yeah, this is very true.
It could be just that it's a ficus.
Yeah. I mean, moving a ficus from one place to another could also cause leaves to drop as well. But in your particular situation, it sounds like it needs to be repotted. So I would definitely do that. And I would hold off on the fertilizer too until after that new flush of growth has come out. Somewhere 3 to 4 weeks after you do the repot, after you do the defoliation, you should be A-okay. At that point. I mean, ficus are actually pretty strong trees. If you have them in a hot environment, they should bounce back, no problem. They're pretty tough little guys. So, all right. The next question comes from a buddy of mine, John Gene Angel. Says, over the years, my taste for bonsai has dramatically evolved and changed. How are your tastes and preferences in all things bonsai developing and changing? What about you, Cameron? What do you think? What's changed for you?
I think I learned that I think junipers are overrated.
What? Blasphemy. Get out of my nursery.
I don't like junipers.
What? Oh, man, I am disappointed. We're going to have to change your attitude about that.
They're mean to me, and they're cooler things. We need to see more hinokis and so many more deciduous things like poplars. I love poplars, but I have no idea how well they do in different places, and a lot of them grow really fast and just sucker up, and I don't know. But I would love to see more like genres of bonsai, because we got like styles going on, but what if we got into cool random shit with trees? I don't know. That's what I want to see more of, is actually like defining, this is I don't know, but I want to see the rock and roll of bonsai develop soon. So I want to see us move in different directions.
Sure. Are you talking aesthetically or
yeah? Aesthetically mostly. And in the actual trees we use, it's cool to see us move away from everything being, Japanese maples and Japanese black and white pines, and it is nice to see like Rocky Mountain junipers, but they're the only good ones.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and I would say, similar thing. when I lived in Japan and worked on the material there, I always knew that we had really good stuff in the States, native wise out in the mountains, particularly from out west, particularly the conifers. To work with. Now that I'm back and working with a lot of that stuff, I was very excited to try to work with the native foliage as much as possible when I got back. And after having worked with that for a number of years, I realized that I don't particularly care for it. It doesn't yield good enough results in a lot of instances. That's not to say you can't have like a Rocky Mountain juniper with fantastic foliage. As a matter of fact, we've got one here that's got foliage easily as good as any Kishu or pretty close to a lot of Ito-Igawa foliage that I've worked with. Fantastic tree. So again, just like deciduous stuff, you're going to find that range, from coarse to fine, from stuff that, stays upright and really compacts to stuff that flops. You have everything in between. But on the whole, working with something like a Rocky Mountain juniper, I would say like 98% of the time it's going to be pretty bad foliage. And there are ways to improve it and make it better, but the amount of effort and work that goes into it for the results that you get quite often is just not worth it. So this year, actually last year, we started grafting. Not all, of course, it's never all, I need a shirt that says not all on it. It's never all, but we've started grafting a lot of the Rockies in particular with better foliage. And, we're going to get some blowback, I'm sure. Maybe it'll be good for another Talk Shit Get Hit segment in the future. But I'm using non-native foliage on a lot of these Rocky Mountain junipers, particularly Ito-Igawa. If you've ever worked with Ito-Igawa foliage and you've ever worked with Rocky, you'll know the differences in the amount of work that you have to put into it and the amount of good yield that you get out of it on the back end. Ito-Igawa, and again, you can find a spectrum there, of course, defined. Depending on the size of the tree that you're working with, I will graft a slightly coarser Ito-Igawa foliage on a larger Rocky Mountain juniper, for example, and slightly finer Ito-Igawa foliage on the smaller trees. So you get a much more natural appearance that way. The beauty that you get out of the development of that type of foliage is above and beyond anything that you would get with a vast majority of the Rocky foliage. And that being said, like I said, just because 98% of the Rockies have crappy foliage doesn't mean I'm grafting 98% of the Rockies that we have here. I have some Rockies here that don't have great foliage. It's not horrendous foliage, but the trees are so special that I want to try to maintain that natural foliage on the tree. So that's what we're doing. I'm dealing with, the extra work that you have to do to make them look good in favor of keeping that native foliage on the tree. So I'm not one of these people that says you got to graft everything. So don't think that. But the ones that are just hopeless, and there are some that are hopeless, it's better to graft them. And if you're going to graft, why would you graft with anything other than the best foliage that's out there? The stuff that's going to stay in the right location, that's going to fill in nicely, it's going to look the most beautiful. And that tends to be Ito-Igawa. I know a lot of guys out in California like working with the Kishu. Out there in certain environments, like in San Francisco or Sacramento, those areas, the Kishu foliage, particularly in San Francisco, is crazy. It looks like broccoli. It looks really cool. It tightens up. I've bought Kishu from those locations and brought them back to Tennessee here. As soon as we bring them here, they relax, they elongate, and they look much more like the Kishu that you would see, in Japan. Right. So the growth habits are completely different depending on the environment as well. So that's why when we get like a Rocky, for example, from, the guys at Backcountry or anybody who's collecting out west and we bring it here, I do not graft it immediately. Typically, I wait at least a couple of seasons, 2, 3, 4 seasons to see how that foliage adjusts and changes in our environment here relative to what it was doing in its native environment. Sometimes it'll become more compact. Sometimes it'll loosen and flop more. So it really just depends on the particular tree. Grafting would be one thing that I've sort of shifted my approach towards here. In terms of design and whatnot, I haven't really shifted away from what I learned in Japan as an apprentice and how I designed plant material there. And I have seen nobody who has studied in Japan who has done anything like that. I've seen a lot of people who have done the same stuff that we've done in Japan and then claim that they're doing something different. But I haven't seen anything actually aesthetically different. So for me personally, the approach that I take to designing trees, I have my own sort of personal take on how I like to design things, and it's going to be slightly different from this professional versus that professional versus, you know, somebody in Japan. But you'll always be able to see the influence, obviously, of, you know, where I studied specifically in Japan and the fact that I studied in general in Japan. You'll always be able to see that, and you'll always be able to see that in anybody's work who did, you know, a similar apprenticeship in Japan as well. And I've said it before, you know, it's not that it all looks the same. It's that there are micro differences subtle differences between each of those artists. And to me, that's way more interesting, trying to figure out, you know, who did what and why they did it and why it's slightly different aesthetically than this other artist, than it is in trying to do something ridiculously different that usually fails. It looks like crap. It looks very kitsch for the most part. You know, I hate to burst your bubble, but there's good art and bad art out there. There really is, you know, and we could get into a discussion of modern art sometime.
Oh boy!
I went to the Modern Art Museum in Tasmania, you know, south of mainland Australia.
I didn't know
there
they had modern art in Tasmania.
It was one of the strangest places I have ever been. They actually had a machine that was built by an artist there that, on one end of it, you put, you know, vegetables and fruits and food into it, and then it's this giant machine. You can see it. It's all like clear piping and stuff. And at the other end of the machine, it has this little bitty sort of tube that comes down on a plate, and the machine will take a dump on the plate.
I thought
and
this
it
was going to
smells
go in a poop
like
direction.
It's. I mean, the machine produces poop, like human poop, basically.
Okay.
And that was in the art museum there. So, hey, you know, if that's good art, whatever, that's fine. You know, everybody's got their own, you know, approach to things, I guess. But you know, when you're talking about something like bonsai in particular, cool. If you want to experiment. If it looks like crap and people call you out on it, you know, tough cookies again. You know, if it looks like crap and nobody gravitates towards it, I mean, that's fine. So if it makes you happy as a person to create something like that, totally cool. Do your own thing. But being different for the sake of being different, I find to be incredibly boring. I find it to be the most boring thing in the world.
And kind of desperate.
Exactly. It's boring because it is desperate. You know, it's so typical. It's a cliche in and of itself.
Typical.
It's so typical. You know? It is a cliche in and of itself.
Yeah.
You know, there are good things about progress, and there are bad things about tradition, and there are good things about tradition and bad things about progress. It goes both directions. So I'm not an advocate for 100% in one direction or the other, but I refuse to have, you know, people poo-poo what I do and then say you're only doing it for tradition's sake, which I'm not. We're trying new things here, and you know, we're doing things incrementally, which I think is a smart way to do it. You know, if you look at like Japanese history, for example, everything that is sort of intrinsically Japanese, I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of stuff that's considered sort of intrinsically Japanese did not begin in Japan. It began mostly in China and Korea. And was imported into Japan, you know, in the Nara period, the 700s, 800s, you know, and then into the 1100s, 1200s. You know, a lot of the art, a lot of things that, you know, like kakejiku, for example, hanging scrolls, particularly the ones that are monochromatic, like the one behind us here, that was inspired by, you know, Southern Song Chinese period paintings, you know, and the Japanese took it and did something slightly different with it. Same thing with bonsai, started out as penjing, brought to Japan, things were changed, things were morphed, and now when you say bonsai and standards in bonsai, people think Japan, they don't think China. What's interesting too, if you look at China nowadays, a lot of those penjing, like the water and landscape penjing that were developed by different people like Brook Zhao, for example, one of the nicest guys in penjing in China, really interesting guy, does fantastic work. If you look at some of the penjing that he created in years past, what you're seeing now in China, you know, in the past, those trees that were created had very little ramification. You know, the landscapes were cool; they looked pretty natural. But nowadays, what's happening in China is they're taking the standards of Japan in terms of developing ramification, soft branching on the trees, profuse ramification, and applying those to the old penjing. So you're seeing these water and landscape penjing that are 40, 50 years old that are now starting to ramify in the same way that the Japanese trees are. So they're taking that standard of development and applying them to the penjing. So you're seeing sort of this almost like hybridization, basically, in China, which is really cool. So it's quite interesting. So that's basically what my goal is here, taking our native material and doing that with it, essentially. So hope that answers your question. All right. Okay, let's do one last question here. Okay, so this has to do with collecting Japanese maple seedlings, and this question comes from Orlando Diaz. He said that he's been collecting some Japanese maple seedlings around the base of some Japanese maples that he planted in his landscape from 13 years ago. He just collected the seedlings this spring. He planted the seeds in little trays, I guess. He says he's not sure exactly what he's doing with the seedlings, but what should he be doing in terms of developing those into bonsai? So we've actually been doing quite a bit of that here at Eisei-en with seedlings. As a matter of fact, my dad's place, my parents' place in Knoxville, they had a Japanese maple in their yard that had the tiniest natural leaves I've ever seen. It was just a standard Acer palmatum, so it's seeded everywhere. He collected a bunch of the seeds, and we've got them here at the nursery. So this is the second year. He collected them last spring. They grew all last year. This is the second year. We actually up-potted them into net pots with the typical Aoki blend, 50% Akadama, 25% Kiryu, 25% lava rock, and we wired the trunks on those up. Some of them we planted in clump style, which you can watch our video on clump style Japanese maples from earlier this year in March. On how to do that with seedlings. And some of them we took just single trunks, wired the trunks up, put a lot of motion and movement into them in the hopes of creating, shohin to medium-sized trees. But essentially what you want to do is take aluminum wire, over-exaggerate the movement in those trunks. And then as the wire starts to bite in just a little bit, a couple months after you apply it in the spring, take that wire off. Those trunks will relax a little bit, which is why you want to over-exaggerate them to begin with. And then again, just like the black pines, we're going to let the terminal bud at the very top of those elongate for 2, 3, 4, 5 years to thicken the trunks while we maintain the lower branches on the tree. So the goal is to get fatter trunks on those plants, develop ramification on the lower branches on the tree, and then eventually we'll cut that elongating shoot at the top off and have a nice shohin to medium-sized tree. Typically shohin are going to be created with air layers, using air layers. But if you're using seedlings, not a problem at all. You can do that, and then you just need to develop the roots properly. One technique you can use for that is the Ebihara technique, which I've covered in my online courses with Bonsai Empire, the advanced course, I think part 2. We covered that technique. So again, I'll put a link to that down in the description down below so you can check that out as well. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit there. There's a lot more involved than just that, but hopefully that gives you a decent idea there. All right, so that's going to do it for this episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. I want to thank you guys for hanging out with us again this week. If you like what we do here, make sure to like and subscribe either on YouTube for our video cast or on your podcast app. What they call it, podcast catcher or something like that.
Sure.
I don't
Stitcher.
know. Stitcher's one of them. I don't know. iTunes.
SoundCloud, where you get all your best music.
Right. I am going to be putting out a rap album on SoundCloud soon, the obligatory rap album. So, all right. In any case, if you want to donate to help us out, definitely click on that link down below. We really appreciate all of your support. And until the next episode, take care.
Yeah.